Two places on the surface of this Earth are about as far apart as it is physically possible to be. Australia sits in the southern hemisphere, surrounded by ocean on every side, isolated from the rest of the world by thousands of miles of open water. The Amazon rainforest sits in the heart of South America, on the opposite side of the planet, buried inside a continent that the rest of the world did not even know existed until 5 centuries ago. These two places have no obvious connection. No ancient trade route links them, no ocean current runs directly between them, no geological event tied them together. No one has ever proposed that the Aboriginal Australians and the indigenous peoples of the Amazon were the same civilization, or neighboring civilizations, or civilizations that had any meaningful contact with each other at any point in recorded history. And yet when scientists extracted the DNA of indigenous people deep in the Brazilian Amazon and compared it to the DNA of Aboriginal Australians, they found something that should not be there. A genetic signal. A fingerprint pressed into the chromosomes of people living 12,000 miles apart, in two completely different environments, speaking completely different languages, practicing completely different cultures. A biological signature so consistent, so measurable, and so statistically undeniable that the researchers who found it in 2015 did not initially believe their own results. They ran the numbers again, they checked their methodology, they asked other geneticists to look at the data. And every single time the answer came back the same. These people share something. Something old, something that has no clean explanation. Something that has been called, by the scientists who discovered it, one of the most intriguing and poorly understood events in all of human history. This is the story of what they found. And the more you understand it, the less sense it makes, until you follow it all the way to the end, where it opens into something even stranger than the discovery itself. To understand why this genetic connection is so baffling, you need a baseline understanding of what we thought we knew about how human beings spread across the planet. The story, as it has been told for the last several decades, goes roughly like this. Modern humans evolved in Africa somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, they lived and spread within the African continent. Then, somewhere around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a group left. They crossed into what is now the Middle East, and from there began the slow generational spread that eventually populated every habitable corner of the globe. One group moved through Asia and eventually reached the coastlines of what is now Southeast Asia. From there, some of them made what would have been an extraordinary journey across open water to reach the ancient supercontinent of Sahel, a single landmass that today we call Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, before rising sea levels separated them. These were the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea. They arrived, by the best current estimates, between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago. They settled. The sea rose, and they were cut off from the rest of the world, isolated on their island continent for 50,000 years, longer than any other human population has ever been isolated anywhere on Earth. Separately, in a completely different part of the story, another group of humans eventually worked their way north through Asia and reached the extreme northeastern tip of Siberia. There, during the last ice age, when global sea levels were low enough that a land bridge connected Siberia to Alaska, they crossed into the Americas. The best evidence currently suggests this happened somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, though some sites push that date back further and the debate is ongoing. These were the ancestors of all Native American peoples, from the Arctic peoples of Canada and Alaska all the way down to the Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America. These two migration stories, the Australian story and the American story, were understood to be completely separate branches of the human family tree, diverged, independent, unconnected for tens of thousands of years. Then came 2015. Two completely separate research teams, working independently of each other, published studies in the same year that arrived at the same impossible conclusion. When they analyzed the genomes of certain indigenous groups living in the Amazon basin of Brazil, specifically the Surui, the Caritiana, and the Xavante peoples, they found a genetic signal that matched nothing in the expected Native American pattern. It did not match Siberian or East Asian populations, which is what the standard migration model would predict. It matched the Onge of the Andaman Islands. It matched the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea. And it matched Aboriginal Australians. The signal was not tiny or ambiguous. It was clear. It was consistent. And it pointed unmistakably to a shared ancestor somewhere in Australasia, on the opposite side of the world from where these Amazonian people lived. The scientists had a name ready almost immediately because naming things is how science begins to think about them. They called it the Y signal, Y for Waipiquera, a word from the Tupi language of Brazil that means simply ancestor, because that is what it represented. Proof of an ancestor that did not fit the story. A ghost in the genome, a population that had passed through the history of humanity, left its fingerprints on the DNA of people living thousands of miles apart, and then, as far as anyone can tell, vanished. Not gradually absorbed into other populations in a way that left a visible trail. Just gone. And then in 2021, things got more complicated. A new study extended the search for the Y signal beyond the 3 Amazonian groups where it was first detected. What they found was that it was far more widespread than anyone had realized. The signal showed up in the Chotuna people of Peru, a group with ancestral ties to the Pacific coast. It showed up in the Guarani Kiowa of central west Brazil. It appeared in multiple indigenous groups along the South American Pacific coast. The Yipiquera signal was not a fluke, limited to 3 isolated Amazonian tribes. It was spread across the continent, concentrated most heavily in coastal populations and the Amazon, and it appeared to represent at least 2 distinct waves of people carrying this ancestry. One that settled along the Pacific coast first, and a later group that moved inland into the Amazon. That geographical pattern matters, because if the people carrying Australian-linked DNA entered South America from the north, through the Bering Land Bridge, down through North America, and into South America, you would expect to find traces of the Y signal all along the route, in North America, in Central America, in the Caribbean. And that is not what the data shows. The signal is essentially absent from North and Central American populations. It appears almost exclusively in South America, which means either that the people carrying this ancestry somehow bypassed thousands of miles of North America entirely, moving fast enough and in small enough numbers that they left no genetic mark on the populations they passed through, or that there was a separate route into the Americas that did not go through North America at all. The mainstream explanation, the one most geneticists currently favor, is the coastal highway hypothesis. The idea is that a small group of people carrying Australasian ancestry made their way through Siberia, mixed with Beringian populations, crossed into Alaska, and then hugged the Pacific coast as they moved rapidly southward, staying close to the ocean rather than moving through the interior of the continent. By sticking to the coast, they would have bypassed the interior populations of North America, leaving minimal genetic traces in groups who never encountered them. The coastline itself has changed dramatically since the end of the last ice age. Rising sea levels have submerged much of what would have been the coastal migration route, destroying any archaeological sites that might have been left there, which is a frustratingly convenient reason why no direct evidence of this migration has been found. But there's another explanation that the data cannot rule out, and it is the one that makes certain researchers deeply uncomfortable to even discuss. What if there was direct contact across the Pacific? What if some group of people, somehow, made the crossing from the Pacific Islands or from Australia itself to the coast of South America? It would have been an almost incomprehensibly difficult journey. The Pacific Ocean is the largest body of water on the planet. Even today, crossing it requires advanced technology. Doing it in a small boat, with no GPS, no charts, no knowledge of what lay on the other side, with nothing but stars and ocean currents to navigate by. The idea strains credibility, and yet we know it was done. The Polynesians did it, repeatedly. They colonized virtually every habitable island in the Pacific, navigating across thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, guided by knowledge of stars and waves and bird behavior that modern oceanographers still do not fully understand. And there is now solid genetic evidence that ancient Polynesians reached South America. Sweet potato plants domesticated in South America show up in Polynesia, and the genomes of certain Polynesian populations carry a clear genetic signature from South American peoples. That contact happened. It is proven. The Pacific was crossable. It was crossed. The Y signal predates Polynesian contact by thousands of years. Whoever carried Australian-linked DNA into South America did so long before the Polynesians were sailing anywhere. But the point stands. The idea that prehistoric people could not make extraordinary ocean voyages is not supported by the evidence. The first Australians crossed open water to reach Sahul 50,000 years ago. At the very dawn of complex human behavior, that crossing required boats. It required navigation. It required the ability to organize a group of people for a journey across ocean to a destination they had never seen and could not confirm existed. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians did something that archaeologists still struggle to fully explain 50,000 years before the birth of any civilization we currently recognize as such. This brings us to perhaps the most staggering finding in all of modern human genetics. Not the Y signal, as extraordinary as it is, something more fundamental. When researchers completed a comprehensive analysis of indigenous Australian DNA, published in the journal Nature in 2023, the result of careful work conducted in genuine partnership with 4 remote indigenous communities, what they found inside those genomes broke records that nobody had expected to be broken. The genetic diversity among Aboriginal Australians is greater than the genetic diversity observed in almost any other human population on the planet outside of Africa. Specifically, The DNA differences between the Tiwi Island communities of northern Australia and indigenous desert communities of central Australia are comparable to the genetic distance between people from Bangladesh and people from the United Kingdom. 2. Groups of people living on the same continent, separated by a few thousand kilometers, are as genetically distinct from each other as populations from opposite ends of Eurasia. That is not what you expect from any population that has only occupied its territory for a few thousand years. That level of divergence takes an enormous amount of time to accumulate. It requires populations that have been separated from each other and evolving independently for tens of thousands of years. It is, in the bluntest possible terms, the genetic signature of extreme antiquity. And it confirms something that Aboriginal Australians have said about themselves for as long as anyone has been listening. They are the oldest continuous civilization on the face of the earth, not the oldest ancestors of some other civilization that went on to do greater things, not a founding population that gave rise to more complex societies elsewhere. The oldest continuous, unbroken human civilization, the same culture, the same connection to the same land, living and evolving and accumulating knowledge for 50 to 65,000 years without interruption. When you try to put that number into human terms, it becomes genuinely difficult to process. The pyramids of Egypt are 5,000 years old. The Roman Empire rose and fell within a span of about 1,000 years. Every civilization you learned about in school, Mesopotamia, Greece, China, India, the Aztecs, the Maya, all of it, every empire and every king and every invention and every war fits inside the last 5,000 years of human history. Aboriginal Australian culture stretches back 10 times that far. Their stories about the landscape, about mountains, rivers, lakes, coastlines, have been passed down through oral tradition and have been cross-checked against geological records. Some of them describe landscapes that were changed D by sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, over 7,000 years ago. They are, by any reasonable measure, the oldest recorded oral history in human existence. Now take that already staggering picture and fold in one more layer. When researchers looked more closely at the Aboriginal Australian genome, they found something inside it that should not technically exist according to the standard model of human evolution. Around 4% of the Aboriginal Australian genome comes from what the scientists describe as an unknown human relative, a group that is related to but distinct from the Denisovans, the ancient human species discovered in a Siberian cave whose DNA shows up at low levels in many Asian and Pacific populations. Whatever these unknown hominins were, the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians interbred with them somewhere in Southeast Asia as they made their way toward Sahul. The interbreeding happened, the DNA transferred, and then he group they interbred with apparently disappeared, leaving no known skeletal remains, no identified archaeological sites, no name, no story. Just a 4% contribution to the oldest living human genome on Earth from a people we cannot identify and have never found. The University of Copenhagen's Eske Willerslev, one of the lead researchers behind the comprehensive Aboriginal Australian genome study, described the Australians plainly as probably the oldest group in the Archaeology world that you can link to one particular place. His colleague Anna Sapfo Malaspinas called the genetic diversity among Aboriginal Australians amazing, noting that the differences between groups from southwestern and northeastern Australia exceeded the genetic distance between Native Americans and Siberians, two populations separated by an ocean and a continent. These are not fringe claims made by alternative history enthusiasts. These are findings published in Nature, the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, by researchers from Copenhagen, Bern, and Australian National University. These are peer-reviewed, replicated, independently confirmed scientific results, and yet the full picture those results paint has still not been assembled into a coherent, universally agreed-upon story. The Y signal connecting Amazon peoples to Australia remains, in the words of a Harvard geneticist who has studied it extensively, a puzzle. The question of how Australian-linked ancestry got into South America, whether through a rapid coastal migration from Siberia, through some kind of trans-Pacific contact, or through some third mechanism no one has yet proposed, remains genuinely open. The signal has now been confirmed in study after study, spanning more than a decade of research. It was not an artifact. It was not contamination. It was not a statistical error. As one researcher at Smithsonian Magazine put it after the most recent large-scale analysis was published in 2026, this signal is found again and again and again. It must mean something. What it means, specifically, mechanically, historically, is still being argued. There is something philosophically important buried in all of this that is easy to miss if you are focused on the mechanics of the migration route debate. The standard telling of human history places Western civilization and the civilizations of the ancient Middle East from which it descends at the center of the human story. The great leap forward of human culture happened in Mesopotamia, the narrative says, Writing, law, architecture, agriculture, the foundation of everything we call civilization, was laid in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates, and spread outward from there to build the world as we know it. Other peoples, in other places, are understood in this framework as peripheral, waiting, in some sense, to be encountered by the cultures that were driving the engine of history. The genetics does not support that framing, not even a little. The people living in Australia when European colonizers arrived in 1788 were not primitive. They were not a remnant. They were not a fossil of early humanity, preserved in amber. They were the inheritors and custodians of the longest continuous cultural tradition in human history, a tradition so ancient that by the time the first tea Egyptians set stone on stone at Saqqara, the Aboriginal Australians had already been living on their continent for 45,000 years. Their astronomical knowledge, encoded in stories and passed down through generations, describes celestial events with an accuracy that Western science only recently confirmed. Their understanding of the Australian landscape, its plants, its animals, its water systems, its seasonal rhythms, accumulated over 60 millennia of continuous observation, represents a depth of ecological knowledge that no Western scientific institution has come close to replicating. They were not discovered by history. They were in it first, longer than anyone. And somewhere, somehow, a genetic echo of their ancestors made it to the other side of the planet, got into the bloodlines of people who would eventually become the Surui, the Caritiana, the Zavante, the Chotuna, persisted in their genomes for more than 10,000 years, staying remarkably stable at around 2% of their ancestry across that entire span of time, which suggests it was not being diluted out, not being lost to. The pressures of genetic drift, not fading as unimportant genetic contributions tend to fade, something about it persisted. Researchers have suggested it may have persisted because it was advantageous, that whatever this Australasian genetic component contributed to the biological, what was it? What advantage did Australian genes confer on people living in the Amazon? Nobody knows yet. The studies have identified the signal. They have mapped its distribution. They have begun to trace its probable migration routes. But the question of what is actually inside those genes, what specific biological traits, what immune responses, what physical or neurological adaptations traveled across the world in the blood of those ancient migrants, that question is still waiting for an answer. And here is what makes all of this simultaneously maddening and extraordinary. The people this story is about, the Aboriginal Australians, the Amazonian peoples, the Andaman Islanders, the Papuanes, are all still here. They are alive. They are the custodians of the longest unbroken human traditions on Earth. And they have been saying, in various ways, for a very long time, that their stories go back further. That any outsiders ever believed that their connections to the land and to each other are deeper than anyone from outside their cultures has ever fully understood. For centuries, the scientific establishment responded to those claims with skepticism or outright dismissal. Now the science itself is beginning to catch up. The genome does not lie. It cannot be rewritten to suit a comfortable narrative. It holds every migration, every encounter, every improbable crossing, every vanished people that was somehow preserved as a fraction of a percentage in the chromosomes of their distant descendants. It is the deepest archive we have. And what it says about the relationship between Australia and the Americas, about the ghost population that connects them, the 10,000-year-old signal that keeps showing up in study after study, the oldest civilization on Earth quietly, carrying DNA from a people we cannot even name, is that the history of humanity is far longer, far stranger, and far less understood than the version most of us were taught. The results, as the scientists who found them said, make no sense, not in the framework we had. The framework may need to change,